Okay, excellent. Well, let's start then. Thank you everyone so much for coming to the session today. You all know what you signed up to. It's me talking about my Churchill Fellowship report entitled "The Person Most Likely to Kill a Victim of Domestic Abuse is Themselves." Obviously, it is a topic around domestic abuse and suicide, both of which on their own are very emotive and sensitive and often painful subjects. And obviously, when you combine them, it becomes even more so. So please look after yourselves. I'm not going to be offended if at any point you need to duck out. I'm sure with this many people, over 500 people on the call, there will be many people with lived experience of either suicidal thoughts, being bereaved by suicide, or being a victim of domestic abuse, or perhaps a combination of all three of those. Please look after yourselves and don't feel you need to put yourself through listening to this if you are struggling. The recording will be available. We are recording now. This recording will be made available at a later time, so you'll be able to catch up. And obviously, the whole point of this is to launch my Churchill Fellowship report. And at the end of the session, we'll provide the links for you to download the Churchill Fellowship report. And hopefully that will be a lot smoother process downloading the report than it was letting you all into this webinar. But honestly, I am beyond grateful for how many of you have come and given up your time on this Monday afternoon to come and hear myself and Nicole speak. When we put out this invitation, I couldn't believe that we'd get more than 50 or 100 max. And not only have we got more than 500 in the room, we had 800 people register to attend. So I'm very grateful for that. But I think it also just shows the intense amount of interest in this subject. I think this is a subject where, although I've been saying that my report is the first comprehensive report into this subject, and I think it is, that doesn't mean that a lot of people haven't been aware that this problem exists. And many of you will have been doing your own different things to raise the profile of domestic abuse related to suicides and try and work on the front line, or try and work in policy or government positions to influence them as well. So it's not a new topic, and I'll go into that further later on. But it is obviously a very intense subject that a lot of people care deeply about. My next thank you is obviously to Nicole, who you can see on the screen. Many of you will know Nicole. She is the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. I've been lucky enough to have met Nicole on a number of times and spoken to her about this subject on a number of occasions going back over the years. And Nicole has always been a massive supporter of the work that I've been doing, and also the issue in itself. So thank you, Nicole, again, for giving up your time to come and be part of this event today. I think I'm going to hand over to you now and hear what you've got to say, and then I'll come back on and give my presentation after you've spoken. So over to you, Nicole.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Tim. I'm like you. I'm really so pleased that you've gone to such efforts to bring this information to us, Tim, and I'm really pleased that there's so many people who are here. It's as much as of a topic that is we all feel so strongly about, and is based in so much tragedy in lots of ways. Obviously, it's something that also should encourage us all, that there's so much interest in, what can we do better? What should we be learning? Breaking down some of the silos that I think we've had between suicide prevention work and work to address domestic abuse. So I'm just really pleased for you, Tim, that you've got so much interest in the work that you've done. And I am only going to say a few words because I appreciate you'll want to hear about Tim's work and what led him to it, and all of what he's learned in his Winston Churchill Fellowship. And I'll remain around for questions at the end, but I'm sure absolutely will be mainly focused with Tim and the knowledge he's built up and what he's got to say to us today. But for those of you who are here who may not know me personally or might not have heard of my work, my name is Nicole Jacobs. I'm the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, and my role was created in the Domestic Abuse Act, which received royal assent a couple of years ago. And I was appointed as a designate right at the very end of 2019, right as we were coming into 2020 and in March with COVID striking. And I was appointed as a designate, but the role was created in the Domestic Abuse Act. And I then, once that passed, really dropped that designate term, and I picked up my office picked up a couple of powers that were delegated to me or to us in the Domestic Abuse Act. And one is an ability to seek information from public bodies. So there's public bodies listed in that legislation that have to comply when I'm asking for information. And I cannot do that for individual survivors or to advocate for individuals. I have to be seeking information in order to advocate for progress as a whole, how we can have a more consistent approach across England and Wales to domestic abuse. And I'm able to make recommendations to public bodies that have to be responded to within 56 days. And a lot of those powers that were given to my office in the Domestic Abuse Act are oriented because there's a very wide acknowledgement that we have a long way to go in order to have consistent responses to domestic abuse. That would include, a basis of services in every area that are more similar than different, which is a lot of what we have now. I often, in very shorthand, try to explain it in this way. If you think about the perspective of our first refuges, just upwards of 50 years ago, that is not very long in the whole scheme of things in terms of our response, our understanding about domestic abuse, our growing understanding over the last 50 years predominantly, and changing understanding about, we would have called it domestic violence, thought of it as a very private matter. I think our attitudes and rightfully have changed, and we have a whole and in fact, in our legislation, defined way of looking at domestic abuse, understanding domestic abuse in its wider range, the impact on adults and children, the fact that it is obviously not physical only, sexual abuse, coercive and controlling behaviors that are non-physically abusive but are defined as abuse, economic abuse, and so on. So we've made a lot of strides in the last 50 years, but we're not there yet. And we have so much work to do to make sure that our systems understand domestic abuse. None of them, whether you think of housing or criminal justice or family court or health systems, were really built with an understanding of domestic abuse. And that systemic change is really what we need. And so, as I'm not a party political I'm not a minister of this government. I'm a public appointee. I advise the government. And so I'm selected by the government to both challenge them, but also give advice. And I'll talk a little bit, maybe just at the end of my comments, of some of the reports that we've done. But along comes Tim Woodhouse, kind of in terms of my radar, very early as I was appointed into this role. My background is domestic abuse services in various kinds and various places and charities. But I had always made this connection. I think most people who work in domestic abuse obviously can think of instances where you see a very clear connection between someone who has died by suicide and domestic abuse, and understanding that context. But I had also found it quite disconnected in many ways. And very early in COVID, Tim would have got in touch with my office, my little small emerging growing office, because it was brand new at the time. And he talked about the work he was doing in Kent and Medway, which made perfect sense to me, but also I could see was very groundbreaking. And that he was trying very hard in his day-to-day work to make those connections, to learn from domestic homicide reviews and thinking about what more that he could be helping lead and do in Kent and Medway. And I'm sure he'll tell you in much more detail about that. But it really inspired me. And it also happened alongside some of what I was seeing emerging very quickly in COVID with police leads, the vulnerability knowledge kind of work within policing, where they started to do things they had never done before in terms of tracking domestic abuse related death. And we could see very quickly this pattern, and I'm sure some of you have seen the reports, and I know Tim will mention in more detail some of the key reports that we started to see in COVID. Some of the emerging leaders alongside Tim, Dr. Sarah Danger, some of the work from Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, really looking into suicide in particular. And I just can't thank the Winston Churchill Fellowship enough for giving Tim this opportunity to travel, to really take the best of what he has learned and can learn in other places and bring it back to us. And I think we're all here, all 563 of us so far and counting, to really understand what more we can do. And I wanted to just say a word or two about context. Of where we are with our new government, and just so that as Tim is talking, you could be thinking along with me about what are the opportunities that we have right in front of us. So obviously we've all seen our change in government since the time I was referring to when I was first appointed. We have a government that has an ambition of having violence against women and girls in a decade. Of course, a lot of that does fall under the kind of plans for a violence against women and girls strategy, but also domestic abuse is such a huge part of that strategy. That includes men and women. It includes all victims of domestic abuse. But we have a real opportunity in this government as they set their strategy and next spending review to really make the most of the kind of learning across many, many areas where we need to improve and raise the bar and take those next really much larger strides for a much more consistent response to domestic abuse. And that will be happening. It's happening, really, the plans for that behind the scenes right now in government. There is a Safer Streets Mission Board where this ambition sits under the Safer Streets mission of this government. There is an interministerial board that addresses violence against women and girls that is meeting monthly. There's a big evidence sprint going on within government. Each department are thinking of how they're contributing to that mission of having violence against women and girls. And that should culminate. I commonly say to day to day in the office, the cards will be on the table in the spring, because we'll have our spending review, we'll have a published strategy, which is linked to the funding in this area. So there's a lot going on. This is very good timing for Tim and for all of you to be asserting in any which way that you can what is needed. I can see there's many, many health professionals on this call. There's many people from local government, all sorts of areas where we need a very clear and loud voice through not just the Home Office, not just the Ministry of Justice. They all have a huge role to play. But, in Department of Education, our prevention strategies, Department of Health and Social Care, and some of the more devolved decision-making coming to health boards. We have a lot to do to bring this together and get the most out of our plans going forward. If there is one thing I have learned since I've become Domestic Abuse Commissioner and understanding how government works, is that what is in the strategy is what gets prioritized and what will get funded going forward. A lot of what is to play for right now is so important, because once those key decisions get made, it's much more a focus on implementation. There may be some legislation, there may be new things, obviously, that come up or crop up, but so much of the resources allocated alongside that strategy, and it's what we make the most of once those decisions are made. I also wanted to say that you all will know that there's quite big changes afoot in relation to domestic abuse related death reviews. So what we once called domestic homicide reviews will soon be called by all of us domestic abuse related death reviews. There's a statutory guidance that the Home Office will be publishing that we hope will have a really good set of understanding and guidance for us about the complexity of carrying out reviews at the local level. I understand from many community safety partnerships a level of anxiety about these, both enthusiasm to learn from reviews and to really make sure that we are learning as much as we can, but the anxiety about making sure that we know and are feeling supported well enough in terms of those types of reviews. I'll just end with a couple of things that my office is doing that I'd love for you to look out for. I do have a small, but very, I hope very effective, a small team in my office that looks after the kind of actions that stem from reviews. So using the powers I spoke about earlier to really focus our attention on our actions getting done. If they're not, why not? We're piloting work at the local level with police and crime commissioners and obviously community safety partnerships. We'll be publishing a report in the summer, which draws together findings about how we feel action plans from reviews are getting addressed at the local level. Also, we've been asking all of the government departments and statutory bodies about national recommendations so that we can report back more clearly on whether those things are getting done. It's just our way as an office to really give some amplification and momentum to what we have already reviewed and what should, and we should all be expecting is being prioritized in actions stemming from reviews. We also just published a criminal justice report, and we're awaiting our 56-day response from government. It has quite a lot in it, but one of the things that I do feel very strongly about, and it will be part of our report in the summer for domestic abuse related death, is the improvement of how police are supported to investigate unexpected deaths, and how I often am sitting in this room across from many families who years down the line are suffering from the fact that they're not able to achieve clarity because many critical steps that could and should have been done haven't been. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of that today, where it really does take sensitivity on the part of the police, but also a consistent response on the part of the police to make sure that we're understanding the full context of each and every unexpected death. And also we're almost into March now, but in April we'll be publishing a children and young people's report as well, which I think will touch on some of the things that we'll likely talk about today. But without any more delay, I think I'll hand back over to Tim at this point and just say again a huge thank you to him, to all of the people who have supported and helped Tim, and particularly the Winston Churchill Fellowship, because we do have a lot to do. I think we're about to hear, and we have to all think critically together about how we can work together and make sure that these really very practical recommendations. I think Tim's fellowship has, oh gosh, how many was that, Tim? Quite a
66.
few. 66. I was going to say 77. 66 recommendations that we all need to start thinking about which ones we can start acting on now. So over to you, Tim, and thanks very much for having me.
Honestly, a massive pleasure and a massive honor. Thank you so much, Nicole, for everything that you've said and the support that you've kind of given me over the last few years. Absolutely. Okay, so you got away without Nicole doing any slides. I'm afraid that I have got some slides that I need to put you through, which I'm hoping you can see on the screen. Sophie or Megan, jump in if you can't. As Nicole says, my report is titled 66 Ways to Reduce Domestic Abuse Related Suicides. And as a policy officer, I was once told that you should never have more than like 3 recommendations because otherwise they just don't get done or prioritized. I couldn't limit myself, unfortunately. There is one overarching recommendation which I will be pushing strongly for because I think that the number 1 recommendation, or actually the 66th recommendation is in my report, is the most important. And I'll come on to that later. But everything else, I couldn't do a report like this without saying that actually there is so much that we can be doing. Yes, it's an horrific problem, but there are things that we can be doing right now, some of which don't cost any money, to try and make a difference. So that's what I'm going to talk you through over the next kind of half hour. I'm going to start unusually with some thank yous because actually on this occasion they are just as important as the content itself. I'm going to talk a little bit about my Churchill Fellowship, and if you've not come across what a Churchill Fellowship is, I'm going to try and do a bit of a sales pitch and hopefully inspire one of you. We've got 60 of you in this room, and there's no reason why in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, a number of you couldn't be sat where I'm sitting, and hopefully you will be talking about your life-changing experiences. I'm going to then update a little bit on numbers. This isn't a quantitative presentation, but I do want to set the tone for the scale of this issue with then some overarching thoughts and then some of the 66 recommendations. We don't have time for all of them, but we'll give it a good shot. So first of all, a massive thank you to those people that you can see on screen. So Anna, Jess and Megan, who inspired me to think that I could accomplish a fellowship in the first place. Without people like that believing in me, I wouldn't have ever applied, let alone been able to succeed. So thank you. And obviously to the Churchill Fellowship themselves for funding me to travel around the world and to speak to some amazing people. Sarah's already had one shout out. I would absolutely give her another because it's people like her and Nicole Devlin who, as well as everything else they do in their lives, are also Churchill Fellows in their own right, and they are fantastic examples of what we can achieve. But I've put it in bold to highlight the fact that actually the biggest thank you of all goes to those people, men and women, who have lived experience of being in domestic abusive relationships and experiencing either suicide attempts or feeling suicidal. It's a huge shame to me on a personal level that I can't name you and give you the thanks and recognition that you deserve. But I really hope that you appreciate just how thankful I am. And without your willingness to trust me with your experiences, I wouldn't be able to have put this report together. And I know that some of you are in the audience, some of you are listening to these words. So, and I know I've thanked you privately, but thank you again for everything that you shared with me. And I hope I treat it sensitively and do it justice. Okay, so what is a Churchill Fellowship? Well, if you've not heard of it, it's a ridiculously too good to be true opportunity. The Churchill Fellowship is a charity. It is Winston Churchill's family who are investing in UK British citizens, and they fund them to, as it says on the screen, research anything, anywhere in the world. And they'll pay up to 8 weeks of travel. You can go literally wherever you want to go in the world and research whatever you want to look at. The only thing they ask for in return is that you come back and you try and make a positive change in this country. And obviously that is what I'm doing here today. And obviously you can use Google. The next deadline is in November 2025. Please, and obviously if you want to speak to me about how to apply, then please get in touch and I'll talk you through what it's been like. But you get to do, as I say, go anywhere in the world that you want to. I chose to go to Iceland, Slovenia, and America. This is Iceland, as you can probably tell by the Northern Lights. Just an incredible country where I was lucky enough to go to the European Conference on Domestic Violence, and gave a presentation on this subject, but more importantly, spoke to a huge amount of professionals and researchers from around Europe and the world. I then went to a suicide prevention conference in Slovenia, which again, equally fascinating. Again, another range of different people. And one of the points Nicole made already is that actually the really important thing that I want to achieve with this research is to bring the domestic abuse sector and the suicide prevention sector together, because that's when we'll have the biggest impact. I also went to America. It was about the time that Donald Trump was shot and Joe Biden was still president, which every week seems momentous in American politics at the moment. But at the time, it felt like a huge moment to be in America generally, but also Washington, D.C. in particular. One of the things I did on a spare weekend in DC was to go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which, if you've never been, put it on your bucket list to do. It's an incredibly sobering and most of the time pretty horrific exploration of how African American people, cultures have been treated in the States. But for the purposes of this presentation, there was one very small display on feminist writing, and it talked about Ntozake Shange's report, or no, it wasn't a report, it was a poem, a Korea poem, and it was called For Coloured Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. And it talks about how Ntozake talks about domestic abuse, sexual assault, and being raped as part of her experiences, which led her to consider suicide. And I thought, well, this is obviously meant to be, and I meant to spend the next 48 hours wandering around Washington trying to track down a copy of this Korea poem. I eventually found it in this bookshop that you can see on the screen. I don't know whether you can quite make out the windows, but they are stuffed full of books. It's not like a neat ordered public library. It was literally just books piled on top of each other. And I was searching through almost on my hands and knees. But I found it and I read it, and it's one of the biggest or most powerful books I've ever kind of read. It talks about, well, it's a play. It's a play for, and 7 women talk about their experiences of being abused, both physically, sexually, emotionally, physically, and ultimately it talks about their thoughts of suicide in relation to that abuse. And I really wanted to share a clip from the play for you today. It was really difficult to work out which clip to show you because, well, quite frankly, it's horrific, most of it. But I really like this scene where the women are talking about how their different partners apologize to them after they abuse them in different ways. So here we go. So that was a clip from the play, and I've just had a quick look at the chat, and I apologise that some of you can't see or hear that. I can see that many of you can, so I'm not going to try and fix it, unfortunately. Apologies to those who couldn't see it. We will make the link available so you can absolutely watch the whole play in your own time. Be warned, it's intense and extremely powerful. So please look after yourself while you're doing it. And I wanted to share that kind of clip with you for kind of three reasons. The first of which, actually, it's a fantastic piece of work, and I would encourage you all to read it or find it on YouTube and see a production of it. But also because it was written in 1974, and that really stuck with me because that is literally 50 years ago. Literally 50 years ago, people were writing about this issue, were writing about the link between domestic abuse and suicide, and nothing has changed. Women are dying by suicide now after being abused, just the same way that they were dying by suicide 50 years ago after being abused. So please, let's treat this moment as a wake-up call after 50 years to finally actually do something. Okay, moving forward, here are some more thank yous. Not going to go through these line by line, but just to mainly highlight the fact that actually while I was in the States and Slovenia and Iceland, I wasn't just having nice photographic Instagram worthy moments. I did do a lot of work. I did speak to a lot of people on the screen. And the sensible reason for putting all these names on the screen is that when we get to the 66 recommendations, all of these 66 recommendations have been told to me or been shared about, been spoken about by some of these people that you've seen on screen now. So it's not just me plucking them out of nowhere. These have come from my experiences of speaking to a huge amount of people. The next few slides do have sound on them. The sound is only going to be the words on the screen, so apologies for those of you whose sound isn't working. I apologise, but hopefully you'll be able to read the words on the screen. And these words are from three other people that I spoke to while I was on my travels. Tia makes so many points in that short statement, but the one thing I should tell you is that they're doing much better now. So Tia's suicide attempt was over 7 years ago now, and they're doing a huge amount better. They've made almost a complete recovery. But the point that Tia makes is that actually she did what we would ask somebody in her situation to do. They tried to reach out for support, and yet the support was not forthcoming. We're going to hear about Essence now, and Essence is a different situation where she is one of these people that I'll come on to later on in the presentation, who's known as both a victim and a perpetrator, despite her primarily being a victim. So some of you will recognise the court order mandated anti-violence intervention is something that happens in the States. So Essence is in the United States. But the fact that she had this label now as an offender meant that all the support she was receiving from being a victim of domestic abuse melted away. And then in the eyes of the laws, in the eye of the law, and in eyes of the services, her one single act of self-defense meant that she was seen as an offender. And obviously that had a huge toll on her emotional well-being. And although that is in the States, I can point to many examples in this country where very similar consequences have led to some pretty horrific outcomes. Julie brings a different angle to it entirely. So Julie's story, which was voiced by someone else, as all of the stories have been, was something for me that I hadn't particularly anticipated finding until I started talking to people. And the whole aspect of perpetrator suicide is something that I think has gone unnoticed, really, in all of this. And there are so many different angles and nuances to be explored when a perpetrator takes their own life, and it causes so much damage to those people that they leave behind, that I think is a massive area for us to explore as a society and try and put right. When Julie told me her story, she said that both the suicide bereavement services and the domestic abuse world, their first response was, well, aren't you glad it's over? And of course, well, the abuse wasn't over. And of course, no, Julie was not glad. She never wanted him to die. She just wanted the abuse to stop. Okay, next little section is around some numbers. Many of you who have seen me present before will have heard me talk about the Kenton Medway proportion of 33% of all of our suspected suicides over a 6-year period being implicated and being influenced by domestic abuse. If we extrapolate that 33% nationally, it would mean over 1,800 domestic abuse related suicides annually. That is a huge amount of lives being lost, by definition, unnecessarily. And I don't think we are unusual in this area. I don't think that Kent Medway is a lone figure that somehow is massively worse than anywhere else. In a much bigger sample size in Australia, their figure was about 25% of suicides were impacted by domestic abuse. And that's a much larger sample size. And so, yes, it's not 33%. And maybe if you look at across England and Wales, we'll be closer to 25% rather than the 33%. To be honest, I don't really care what the actual number is. It's just way too many. It's definitely in the thousands, and it's way too many for us as a nation to just be standing idly by and accepting every year. We equally know that whatever the official figures are, it's going to be an underestimate, given how we know that domestic abuse is dramatically underreported. Just wanted to highlight a little bit more breakdown of those figures. Sorry, let me just go back to that one. When you look at the proportion split down, who are people who've known as a victim of domestic abuse or a perpetrator of domestic abuse, or this middle collection of people who are known as both a victim and a perpetrator of domestic abuse, you can see what those extrapolations would look like on a national level. So in Kent and Medway, 6% of all of our suicides are known as victims of domestic abuse only. 13% are known as perpetrators of domestic abuse only, and 10% are both known to the police as both a victim and perpetrator. So if you extrapolate these nationally, these are the types of estimates that you get on a national basis of how many lives are being lost in each of those categories. And I think, well, I mean, they're all horrifically high, but I think this middle number of people known as both the victim and the perpetrator of domestic abuse dying in such numbers are probably where I think we have the most work to do, because it's probably the most unknown about. Are these people who are, like Essence, violently resisting on a single occasion, or are these people who are subject to counter allegations, maybe malicious counter allegations, and who aren't actually perpetrators at all, but they're just being labelled by that, by false reports by the perpetrator. I'm going to give away one of my recommendations early. So recommendation 56 is that we urgently need a national data collection processes. Obviously, these figures are extrapolations from one county figures. That's not good enough. That's not an appropriate way to make national policy. We absolutely need a national data collection on this issue. I think there are ways that it could be done quite simply. There's a real-time suicide surveillance system nationally that's been implemented a couple of years ago. We could include domestic abuse as part of that. We don't at the moment, but it's not beyond the width of us as humanity to be able to do that. And then we'd really have a good understanding of where we're going. So who is dying by domestic abuse related suicides? So definitely female victims of domestic abuse are dying by suicide. We absolutely know that perpetrators are also dying by suicide. And we definitely know that male victims of domestic abuse are taking their own lives. And this is the group who are known to the police as both a victim and perpetrator. And we know from our stats and from our qualitative research that absolutely they are also sadly dying by suicide. But while we think the link might be obvious, we needed to work out a little bit more about why they were feeling suicidal. But for others, it wasn't the thought of being murdered that actually made them feel suicidal. But again, there was a third cohort. So there are three very different stories, very different reasons why those individual victims wanted to die by suicide. And because they've got different reasons for wanting to die by suicide, that must mean for us as services trying to help these people, we need to do different things. It's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. Okay, moving on to some overarching thoughts that I've had over the last couple of years. The first is an obvious one, that this is a national scandal. Just the sheer scale of this means that we should not be sat here accepting that lives are going to be lost in this way. But hopefully, as I've already started to highlight, we're only just beginning to understand the complexity and the nuances that are involved in these deaths. There is definitely not going to be a single solution. The solutions have to be complex and they have to be nuanced. And that's why actually I don't make an apology that there are 66 different recommendations, because without that kind of scale, we're not going to get the progress that we want. I also had lots of conversations about whether domestic abuse was a violence against women and girls issue. And of course it is, but it is not only a violence against women and girls issue. I do believe that the majority of high risk, high harm abuse is perpetrated by men against women. And we do know that many female victims of DA are dying by suicide. However, and as you can see on the screen, I do not believe this is contradictory. We also know that many male victims of domestic abuse are also dying by suicide, I think for different reasons. And again, that leads me to say that the solutions have to be different when we're considering how to support male victims compared to how we support female victims. But it's not an either or situation. It is a yes and situation. We also have to think about the perpetrators, not only because as humanity, it's the right thing to do to try and prevent all loss of life, but actually for the impact on the victims. I do believe that perpetrator suicide can be described as the ultimate act of coercive control. In many ways, in many times, perpetrators choosing to die by suicide, they know exactly what they're doing and they know exactly the amount of pain that they are going to be inflicting on those people that they leave behind. So yes, it's not an either or scenario. It has to be a yes and also scenario. And so, yes, I've got 66 different recommendations, but I've got 10 different areas within which those 66 recommendations fit. And these are on the screen now. So number one, the first area is that we have to support young people better to understand and recognise and value healthy relationships. Number two, my second area of recommendations is that we have to support much better and often different support to women and girls than we do at the moment who are being or have been abused. Number three, we absolutely have to provide much better support to men and boys who are being or have been abused. Number four, we have to develop a better understanding and support for those people who are known as both victims and perpetrators. And I apologise for reading these off the screen, but I think they're worth emphasising, so I'm going to go through them one by one. Number five is that we absolutely have to increase the expertise and capability within mental health and domestic abuse workforces. Number six, we absolutely have to support people who have been bereaved by domestic abuse related suicides much better. Number seven, we need to deliver a better and more effective criminal justice and statutory response. That includes both the police response, but it also includes the domestic abuse related death reviews that we heard Nicole mention earlier. We absolutely have to get much better at perpetrator programs. They need to be more readily available. They need to be better, more effective, and they need to be better evidence-based and evaluated. Number nine, we need much better attention on this issue from policymakers, practitioners, and the public. And number 10, we need a far greater quantity of high quality academic research. There is high quality academic research out there. There are probably, 4, 5, 6 universities and pockets of academics around the country who are doing some amazing work, primarily from the domestic abuse sector, We now need the suicide prevention academics to catch up, work together, collaborate, and produce a much higher set and higher quantity of research. And then my final game changer recommendation, which I'll come on to shortly. So very quickly, just some of my 66 ways. And again, the last slide is a QR code and a link to get the report, so you can go through it line by line. But just in terms of how some ways to support some young people, Nicole Devlin has already been mentioned. She was a Churchill Fellow who went to the States and looked at the Coaching Boys into Men program that's used with American football athletes in American high schools. She's brought it back over to Northern Ireland, and she's implementing it with huge success already to try and help boys understand what an abusive relationship is and behaviour that should not be allowed or tolerated. Likewise, there are programs which can support girls into understanding and recognizing and valuing healthy relationships. The ICU program, again, from the States, is a fantastic one that could be adopted and brought forward here. I guess we could do half an hour just on each of these programs alone. I guess the thing to say here is that it needs to be much more long term than just a half hour PSHE kind of assembly once every year or two. The only points I'm going to raise on this page are numbers 8 and 9, because these are in my cohort of better support for women and girls, but they're exactly the same for supporting men and boys. And that is, when we are having conversations with people who are being abused, I believe that we should always, especially in the first meeting and perhaps even at every meeting, we should ask the direct question, are you feeling suicidal now? Have you ever made a previous suicide attempt? These are two distinct questions. You need to know the answer to both of them. But without knowing the answers to both of them, I don't think you can ensure that the safety plan that you develop with that individual will be adequate in keeping them safe from suicide. And on that, every safety plan that we fill out from now on should have a section which includes how to keep that individual safe from suicide, as well as how to keep that person safe from the perpetrator. These two recommendations, if we all did them tomorrow, I guarantee it would save lives, and it doesn't cost anything. I'm sure that I will get some pushback on some of my recommendations further down the 66, because they will require money and they will require investment, and they're a bit more long term. However, we can all change our practice tomorrow by simply asking the individual in front of us, are you thinking about suicide? If so, what can we do to keep you safe? I saw Natalie's course, Own My Life, mentioned in the chat already. A phenomenal piece of work by Natalie, and I would strongly recommend those of you who don't know it to check it out. But her way of using a strength-based framework to promote the resilience that we've heard in the play clip is phenomenal, and we should try and incorporate that more into the way that we support victims and survivors. This is the similar points, but just obviously when we are thinking about men and boys, we should absolutely still be asking those questions. Are you feeling suicidal, and how do we keep you safe from that? Sorry, let's just going back to that point and thinking about a point that Nicole talked about, the two sectors coming together, the domestic abuse world and the suicide prevention world. It's quite amusing to me, not amusing is the wrong word, it's quite eye-opening to me that both domestic abuse sector and the suicide prevention sector both use safety plans. If I'm talking to a DA specialist, they know what I mean by a safety plan. If I'm talking to a suicide professional, they know what I mean by a safety plan. It would be really easy just to bring those two worlds together and produce a template that we could all use, which addresses both DA risks from the perpetrator, but also the suicide risk. It's something that we could do overnight. Okay, I know I want to ensure time for questions, so I'm going to skip through a little bit. But absolutely, just reiterating the point that we need to really focus in on this group of individuals who are known as both victims and perpetrators. We also need to increase the capability and expertise and also the capacity in terms of just sheer numbers in both the domestic abuse workforces and the mental health workforces. There's lots that we could do about university training, and I've included a quote here where last year Nicole was quoted in the media talking about mandatory DA training in social work courses. She's absolutely right. Of course, it should be mandatory in social work courses, as well as it should be mandatory in the whole gamut of health and care training courses at university. But it's not just a university thing. It should be required and ongoing throughout professional careers. We definitely need to get better at supporting those people bereaved by DA suicides. I won't labour that point. It's been made already. So have these points actually, in terms of the police getting better at pursuing prosecutions for unlawful act manslaughters. There's been some very high profile cases recently which didn't necessarily get the verdicts that we as a sector probably hoped for, but I think there are other prosecutions being considered or being in the courts at the moment, so hopefully the police will not be dissuaded from going after these perpetrators with manslaughter charges. And again, DHR's domestic abuse related death reviews have been mentioned. Only a small amount currently of the suicides reach a DADA, and I think the percentage of suicide deaths should be that do reach the DADA process needs to be increased. I made the point around perpetrator programs already. Not going to labour the point on this, and I know it's not easy to do. It's not easy to get decision makers at national or local level to invest in perpetrator programs. But until we stop the abuses at source, everything else we're doing is just treating the symptom. Some quite simple points here about the government must meet its commitment to reduce violence against women and girls by half. Obviously, that reducing it by half would be a great start. We actually need them to go further and faster. So let's see the new strategy when it's published. And local strategies have an influence as well. So it's not just what happens at a national level only happens if it's in a strategy. The same applies at local level. So please lobby your local suicide prevention groups and your domestic abuse groups to ensure that this issue is considered in both strategies. Finally, we already made this point as well. We just need a huge amount more high quality research being undertaken in these areas. There's so many different things that we don't know about. Suicide risk among victims, amongst perpetrators. We don't know whether different types of abuse have different suicide risks. We don't know how different intersectionalities, such as gender, ethnicity, same-sex couples, we have no idea really how suicide risk is impacted by those intersectionalities. So we need to do that research. My final recommendation, and the biggest, is that we urgently need a national task force to come together and to consider all of my 65 recommendations. If we want to use my 65 recommendations as the starting point for this national task force, then fine. But actually, everyone else in this room will probably have their own version of these recommendations. We need to get everyone together, people with lived experience, charities, policymakers, academics, and we need to have a much more nuanced conversation, national conversation, to develop a national action plan. It can't just be me, and I'm not egotistical to say it is just me. I know there's a huge amount of people working on this, but we need to bring people together to work on this as a collective. It's fantastic that 500 of you are in this room now. It's fantastic that Nicole took time out of her busy schedule to speak. It's phenomenal that the health minister felt that he wanted to give a quote in relation to this report. However, it's going to take an awful lot more of us and a lot of coordinated action to bring these domestic abuse related suicides down. Okay, I'm going to finish it there. If people want to scan the QR code for the actual report, it is there. I'm sure Sophie or Meg will also put it in the chat if you can't get your phones out quick enough, and we'll also email everyone round with the link directly. But if I work out how to stop sharing now, and if anyone, Meg or Sophie, wants to kind of highlight any kind of questions that they want to put to either myself or Nicole, we'll do our best. I don't know whether, Nicole, you've got any first thoughts on that. I know you've seen bits of it before, but you won't have seen the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I am just struck by really the nature of the recommendations and how practical they are in terms of, I really like that you've said to the group there are things that people could, we all could be doing now, like very practice oriented, recommendations. I think that's, I mean, particularly for this wide ranging group, but also I think you're exactly right. It is the time to be putting this to decision makers in terms of what more can we do? What can we do to be proactive? I really like your idea of the task force because even though I feel with the government right now, because of the way they're trying to orient to missions, which means there's quite a lot of meetings across government that maybe should have always been happening, but haven't happened in the same way. There is something about figuring out where is the home of kind of where would this task force be really feeding into, like which of the kind of cross, like for example, I was just meeting with a housing minister this morning, and she was explaining to me that she sits on, a cross-departmental homelessness group versus and also the VOG, the Violence Against Women and Girls group, and child poverty like kind of work across government. So there's a lot of, it's almost like figuring out as the government organizes itself how to truly be situating in the best place. But I absolutely agree that without concerted effort, even though, like you said, I was really struck by the 1974 play, and that was a much better way of getting across what I was trying to say a bit earlier, which is I feel like this has been kind of known, but kind of everywhere, but nowhere within these kinds of strategies, which do set direction for resource decision-making guidance. I mean, it all happens on the ground, I know, but there's so much more we can do. I don't know how we're fielding questions. Would you like to?
Well, so I think there is the Q&A in the chat. I don't know, Megan, whether you've kind of highlighted any that are particularly.
Yeah, we've managed to compile a couple. If everybody can hear me, I hope they can.
Yeah.
Sorry for any issues with the chat and the Q&A. Perhaps we can compile some of them that you might be able to answer, Tim, just for, I guess, time as well. But I've pulled out a couple. So one from Adele Owen. This is aimed at Nicole primarily. The Labour government has agreed to keep the National Suicide Prevention Strategy, but we are still waiting for confirmation that the actions listed will be supported still. Are the police nationally being told to do more and collaborate with local suicide prevention leads to improve data on suicide risk for DA victims / perpetrators?
The first part of that question is, I think it kind of ties into what I would have been saying earlier about the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, for example, which is most of what's happening within government. At the time that the election was called, the new government hadn't been in post long enough really to set the multi-year budget. So they set a 1-year budget, and now we're working towards a spending review that will be announced in kind of, they don't really say a date, but kind of early summer, which will be the multi-year spending review. So all the strategies going forward, anything government's doing, essentially, they kind of know what they're doing in the next financial year, but the strategies are all kind of will be underpinned by that spending review. And you wouldn't, in a way, we wouldn't want them to be publishing strategies without knowing what resource that they're putting behind them. So it's kind of chicken and egg. But I think my guess would be that in the same way, there's lots of work going behind the scenes on many issues, that the prevention strategy you talk about is one. But I would hope that the quality of decision making is better and more joined up because of this mission kind of approach across departments. I would hope that that is the case. And that's the kind of thing we're all in our own ways keeping an eye on and trying to advise as much as we can on. In terms of the police, I noticed in the chat, I'm kind of having trouble picking up what's in Q&A versus the regular chat, but I could see that there was someone from the VKPP, which is the kind of entity that I spoke about earlier that was doing some of that data collection within the police and still are. A couple of weeks ago, there was an announcement from the government call for a new Center for Public Protection. Well, I think it's called Center for VOG and Public Protection. It's kind of taking some of the work that was happening in all sorts of pockets of Home Office and MOJ, bringing it all together. So some of the work on rape and sexual assault, that what people might recognize Operation Soteria as the badge word or kind of title of that work, some of the work that related to violence against women and girls, some of the work that's related to the vulnerability and knowledge hub, so that VKPP work stream, and bringing that all together under one umbrella and adding funding to it. I think it was £13 million total announced. And that will be a new Center for VOG and Public Protection that will be housed at the College of Policing. That would be a very key partner to take that. I mean, we'll be doing this, and I'm sure Tim will as well, and I certainly will. And there are probably people on this call from this, various groups that are coming together to create that center. But that is really critical, because exactly as I think I read in the chat, someone above said, there's so much in terms of how much we depend on the police practice at that very initial point. There's obviously the prevention of people feeling so desperate and unsupported. There's a lot to do, and please read my criminal justice report on the domestic abuse in the criminal justice system. But there's also quite a lot we need to improve in terms of the quality of and consistency of police practice. Tim, I don't know, you probably would like to comment on that too.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that link with the police and the local suicide prevention strategies is crucial as well, in terms of we need to triangulate the data as well as triangulating the response. So yes, the police who are attending these deaths by suicide, they need to get the investigation right. Obviously, they need to be considering whether the domestic abuse was involved and whether manslaughter charges may be appropriate. But they also need to be collecting that data and reporting it back, not only so that we can undertake the domestic abuse related death reviews, but also that the public health teams locally can be looking at that and really understanding the data, and just in terms of population level numbers. So absolutely, the police and local suicide prevention teams and local DA teams have all got roles to play. Meg, probably one or two more. Sorry.
Yeah.
I feel as though we overpromised the amount of questions we were going to have time for. Apologies for that. But yeah, as Meg says, I'm happy to write replies to those and circulate those as well afterwards.
Okay, the second one is from Lakvir. How do we get local mental health commissioners and the NHS alongside public health to consider domestic abuse as a mental health/health issue in a way that makes a difference to funding local services and changing frontline practice to provide the support and interventions to reduce DA suicide?
Yeah, very good question. Nicole, do you want to try first?
I mean, I will say some of the similar things. I think having this information, and I think Tim is exactly right, improvements in the data, but I think we have certainly enough to say to the government now, this is the kind of thing that in every way you orient how funding is used, the guidance you give, the direction you give, you should be doing that to make these connections. But I do think a lot in the mental health space is essentially devolved to the local kind of health partnerships, health boards, and that's, in a way, I understand the reasoning for that, but I find it somewhat concerning in certain areas of work, because in an area like this one, where you're trying to make the kind of inroad and make the clear point of consistency, that flies in the face of the dominance of local decision making, which is kind of prevailing at the Department of Health and Social Care. I understand there's pros and cons, but I do think there needs to be, in certain areas where we need to see this much clearer step change, much more direction from the top, and making sure that we know what good looks like. So thinking about what is it, how can we make sure that areas aren't having to go through all of what Kent and Medway must have gone through a few years ago, and kind of starting to do more and more of this work? How do we learn more quickly, area to area? So there is something government can play a role in that kind of technical assistance, or capacity building, call it what you may, but there's so much more that you could invest so that we could learn so much. The chat is full of great information, by the way, and people posting amazing things in content in the chat, but how do we harness the most of what's been done and start from there?
I think maybe that's the sequel to my report is probably already being written in the Q&A in the chat, hasn't it? I think I just need to get to write another report based purely on the additional insight from the chat and the Q&A, which just kind of highlights the fact that it needs to be a collective response. It can't just be me, and it can't just be you, Nicole. It can't just be the health minister. It needs to be all of us working together and coming up with a national action plan of actions that we can all take forward collectively. I am really sorry, because we've reached 3:30 and we only had 2 or 3 questions, but I do think it's probably fairer to let people go, given that this was the advertised time that we were concluding. So thank you so much to everyone who's given up your time. A huge thanks to Nicole for your time and thoughts and energy as well. And obviously, most of all, thank you to everyone who spoke to me as part of the fellowship investigation, because as well, as I've already said, it without you speaking to me, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this. So thank you very much again. We'll circulate the link to the report. I know it's been in the chat, but we'll do it again properly, so you've got that. We will go through all the questions and answers, and if there's anything more that I need to do, I will get it to you. But thanks again, and hope you all have a rest of the day. Thank you.